Hello, everybody. Oh, yes, the glasses glare. Hello, everybody. Jason here. So, um, I wanted to do kind of a follow-up video to the one that I just did in sort of a way, maybe more of an extension off of it. And because one of the things that I really strongly emphasized in the last video was how very enthusiastic I was about the direction that Total Biscuit was taking Gamergate. The route of conversation and discourse and actually developing a dialogue. And not just a dialogue within Gamergate, but also a dialogue with what Gamergate is, the medium, and even the individuals that Gamergate is objecting to. And in the interview that he had with Attilo, I didn't agree with everything that was said by actually either side. um, though I tended to favor Total Biscuit's position more than I did Tatilo's, but I did actually find that they had a fair amount of overlap. Um, so in the same spirit, I I want to spend some time making my own discourse specifically around the gaming journalism ethics issues. I may dig back into the whole feminism issues at some point as well, but no, I want to focus on the gaming journalism ethics aspect because that's where I think that the meat of Gamergate is at. Um, so first, let me start out by doing something of an analysis on some of the parts of Total Biscuit's conversation with Attilo that I disagree with. One of the interesting things that I found, and I really enjoyed the part of the conversation where they were talking about where's the line for um, where's the line for reporting a journalist's relations with their sources, with the people they're reporting on, or the potential biases that can come. Where's the line on that? Because Tillo actually made a really good point, I believe, in that as a part of being a journalist, you might not necessarily identify your sources as friends, but you certainly have to be friendly to them. You have to interact with them in a way that can certainly mimic friendship and maybe even potentially develop a friendship with them. I think Tatilo's got a really strong point there that a part of being what is my thing? Sorry, my phone was squeaking at me. I would silence my phone. Part of being a journalist is being a friendly person so you can get information. I mean, that's there really isn't another way to do it. That's kind of how you communicate to your readership. I mean, in essence, as a journalist, you are a thoroughfare. You are a thoroughfare of information from the people who have information to the people who want to have that information. So, in order to do that, you have to be friendly. There's really no other way around it. There's just not an option there. You have to. And I think Totillo has a very strong point that it's a part of the job to develop these relationships. Now, granted, they can certainly, extend into the realm of potential bias where, that people know each other on a level that goes beyond what's required for the professional interaction into a personal interaction. But identifying exactly where that is really hard. It is really, really hard. And I would actually say, in response to Total Biscuit, because he later on he had another conversation with a news media uh, person. I'm blanking on exactly who, where he basically said that he he disagrees with Tatilo's stance, that kind of stuff doesn't need to be reported. And I have to counter him by saying that it's kind of a part of the job, and without being able to have a clearly defined line of what is friendly interaction as a part of a job and what is friendly interaction as a part of a personal relationship is can be really really hard to identify. And without actually having a clear line there, it becomes impossible to really say where to put that, or even to really make a statement that that one should or shouldn't be reporting on the particular thing. Now, on the flip side, to kind of object to something that Totillo said, was that he relies on his journalists to identify when a relationship with a source or an individual they're reporting on, or an individual that can provide bias in the reporting gets to a point where it would provide bias in the reporting and should be and that information should be informed to the readers. That creates a problem for me. Now, I understand the challenges in being able to identify where the line is, and I do think that the journalists who are there are in the best position to identify when that line is being crossed. But there is an inherent conflict of interest in having those journalists do that, because if you're a journalist and you start to develop a relationship with some of your sources, and your reporting is going to have an influence on the end result of what they're producing, and you develop something that goes beyond just a regular professional interaction, there's going to be a degree of bias in what you're doing. But the problem is that if you're developing that sort of friendship in a way, then it's kind of assumed, and I think fairly too, that their interests are of importance to you. And so how you report on them will impact their interests in a positive or negative way. And if their interests are of importance to you, then you have an inherent bias towards providing them reporting that will be the most favorable to what's important to them, and therefore biasing the end product. So you end up in this weird conflict where, yes, the people who are on the ground doing the job, doing the reporting, are in the best position to identify when they've hit that bias point, but they also suffer from the most bias in actually accurately, fairly reporting when they've hit that point. So relying on the journalists on the ground doing the reporting, relying on the journalists who are doing the reporting to report when they need to disclose those relationships, it lacks the appropriate level of objective oversight to really qualify that, and it relies on the readership, not on the publication, but on the readership to uncover these biases, which is basically what Gamergate is about. In essence, Totillo's policy on relying on his reporters and not serving as an extra layer of screening is partially what Gamergate is about, because it's putting the oversight of reporting on personal relationships that can bias the information on the readership. And that's a really bad place to put it, because you have Gamergate because of that. I mean, that's exactly what Gamergate's trying to address. So there's not a good answer here. But what we can say is that Totillo's approach is part of the reason we have Gamergate. Now, it runs much deeper than that. Seriously, it runs much deeper than just some people making some bad calls about reporting on their personal relationships in regards to the articles they write. It does run much deeper than that, but that's kind of an entry point. That is a point where there's enough gray and there's enough problems with the system that, now, I do strongly believe that as an editor, Totilo and other editors at Kotaku need to have some sort of screening process in place that's able to identify these personal relationships as they come up. Now, I don't necessarily know what that would be. I mean, I'm not a journalist. I don't know the field. I don't exactly know how it works. And I I can't offer solid recommendations on that. But without that extra layer of screening, you end up with situations like Gamergate because the readership is the ones who have to hold the journalists accountable for reporting on their personal relationships when it's appropriate. So, yeah, you get kind of a problem there. And like I guess I don't really see an easy way out because, in response to Total Biscuit, I think Total Biscuit's being a little overly extreme in his stance and a little too rigid. Um, why? I don't know. Maybe it's because of his position or his perspective. Probably because of his perspective. But I do agree with Totilo that you can't clearly define where that line is, and there's a lot of gray area between being professionally friendly and actually developing a friendship that has the potential to bias the reporting. So it's a very big challenge, and I don't have an easy answer for it. I wish I did, but that's my thoughts in regards to that. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of Total Biscuit's thoughts in regards to scoring game reviews. And I really agree with some of his points that you run into a problem when you have games being when you have a numerical score, especially when it's tied to things like the amount of money that a company gets or the amount of sales that are generated. I think you have a problem when you have and I'll take what Total Biscuit says a step further. Total Biscuit's basically saying that including subjective interpretations in the scoring is problematic. That's basically what he's saying. I would take it a step further in saying that the problem isn't necessarily including subjective assessments in, or isn't just with that, but it's also that different reviewers are including different subjective assessments. Like, one reviewer will include a feminist perspective, another reviewer will include a civil rights perspective, another reviewer might include an animal rights perspective, another reviewer might include an ableist perspective. But unless everyone is including the same perspectives, and unless they're all analyzing it in the same ways, the score kind of loses meaning because you're not doing an apples to apples comparison. It's more like apples to oranges or apples to starfruit or something like that. But you run into problems because of that. So but I do actually also understand, and this is also part of the conversation, Totilo's perspective that, scoring is something that can be useful. And you run into the same problem in any sort of social science work or any sort of research work where there's a big push to quantify as much as possible because it makes it easy. You've got like one number to sort of assess everything, and if you really want to dig into it, okay, you've got a narrative, but great. But you've got one number, and you don't. No, seriously, not a lot of people have the time to really dig into this stuff. For people that this really matters with, yeah, they do, definitely. But for people who are just a little more casual about it or more relaxed about it, it's like, oh, a score, okay, awesome. Now I have a general sense of it. And people, I believe, do keep in mind that, direct comparisons of one game to another, even if they have the same score or if they have different scores, it's a rough science. It's not something that's perfect. But people do still incorporate those numbers into their assessment and their decision to purchase a game. In a bit more of a looser fashion instead of like some sort of rigid, solid thing. I mean, some people are a little bit rigid and solid about it, but still, I think pretty much everybody understands that scored reviews, with scored reviews, that the score is going to have some fudge room with it. Absolutely. But again, because you've got so many different ways of creating that score, it starts to lose meaning, especially in cases, especially with Metacritic, where you have aggregation going on of these numbers to create an aggregate number, which has even less meaning. And you run into the exact same thing in research with, oh gosh, what are they called? Meta-analysis. With meta-analysis, where you take multiple different studies and aggregate the data together, and you just run into problems. Now, but again, these are still useful tools because they're quick and they're easy and they allow people to make a very quick and dirty assessment. So I'm hesitant to get rid of them. But what I would offer is an alternative in that let's identify the parts of games that we can objectively assess. Performance, graphical fidelity, just literally like the gameplay aspects, the mechanical and technical aspects, the parts that really aren't open to as much subjective interpretation. Like, for example, the whole frame rate debacle with a lot of console games these days about, oh, we don't really need to do 60 FPS, but you can make an objective measurement about the frames per second. One person, whether or not 60 frames per second actually matters is irrelevant to that, but you can still measure at 60 frames per second and make an objective assessment that, yes, this is running at 60 frames per second. The subjective part of that is, does that matter? But the objective, there is an objective component to that of, is it present? Does it reach this point? Another thing you can also assess is cross-platform performance. With the exact same settings, does the game run equally well on all platforms that it's available on? Stuff like that. What's available in the options menu? What kind of configuration features does the game have? That's an objectively accessible question. And I think that when review scores you come up with review scores, they should be limited specifically to those objective things. And, there's always going to be some subjective fudging in there, but so much less if we specifically identify what objective factors of games are. So that way the score can sort of represent does this game, how technically functional is this game? How technically capable is this game? And then, we have the narrative to describe the subjective components. Like, is it fun? Is it, what kind of game is it? What sort of category does it fit into? How does this game, how does the story flow? A lot of the subjective elements can be put into the narrative, whereas the objective elements can be a part of the score. And in that way, you get this much more relevant scoring system that has to do with the technical ability of the game and the objectively definable technical capacity of the game, but you still have the narrative to describe, is it fun? So I think that would actually be a really excellent way to kind of balance both of those needs. Now, the score, of course, you would lose some of that subjective interpretation. In doing this, you would lose some of the subjective interpretation that people are used to. It would take time for people to adjust and adapt to that. And that, I think that's okay. I think that's generally okay. And one of the things, maybe as kind of a follow-up to sort of abridge the narrative, because those can get kind of long, and sometimes people just want to quickly zip through things. One of the things that I really liked about, it was either Ars Technica or BitTech that did this, and I'm blanking on which one. But they provided a pro and con list about what was good about the game, what was bad about the game. And it was a really abridged version of the narrative. There's no doubt about that. But I think those are useful as well because it's kind of a halfway point between a narrative and a score. So we can have the score, which, is like, it can be a numerical evaluation of the technical the objective technical competencies of the game. And then you can have a pro-con list to go right along with that to describe some of the more subjective elements. Did this reviewer find it fun? Did this reviewer find that the content was relevant and not offensive? Did the reviewer enjoy the story? That kind of stuff. But yeah, that's just my thoughts on ways to improve how games are reviewed, especially regarding the scoring system, in a way that balances the reality that people just don't necessarily have a lot of time to read through these things with the usefulness of not scoring it, of being able to provide better and more robust information from not scoring it. And just kind of as an example, I mean, for me, I'm kind of an oddball gamer. I mean, there are games that I enjoy that people found meh. The best example of this I can provide is actually a rather old game, Outpost 2, and big fan of the original Outpost. Absolutely loved it. I played it back in my old one-speed CD-ROM drive, way back in the day when CD-ROMs were like this totally new thing. And I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun. And I really wish they would remake that game because that was a fucking amazing game. But the Outpost 2 drifted into the real-time strategy. But it still had a lot, it still had some of the elements of the original, not in the same level. But it was kind of a blend of a real-time strategy and a colony management game. And I liked it because it was much slower paced. It was something that I could relax into a little bit better. And I actually kind of enjoyed the story. I mean, it wasn't terribly well written, but it was kind of engaging. After each mission, I'd get a little bit of story narrative, and that was fun. That was actually really fun. So yeah, I enjoyed that game. But I distinctly remember on GameSpot, back when I actually felt that GameSpot had relevant reviews, I have for the past decade or so been very skeptical of GameSpot. But I still remember back in the 90s when I was like, oh, sweet, this is awesome. And GameSpot gave it like a 6 point something. And I was like, oh, man, but I really like that game. And I'm finding more and more frequently that that's actually coming up. I mean, don't get me wrong, I still enjoy the big AAA games that get all the massively awesome reviews and such, but occasionally I'll enjoy a game that's just like, people are like, that reviewers are like, eh. And I'm especially finding that to be the case with movies. And this is a whole other ball of wax. Like for example, I just recently watched Apollo 18, and what was the other movie I watched? Oh crap, I'm blanking on what it's called. The War Z or something like that. It was one of the zombie movies. I actually enjoyed both of those quite a lot. I mean, Apollo 18 was, it was done in the sort of Blair Witch style of pseudo documentary horror film, and I mean, don't get me wrong, it was definitely a little bit overdone in some places, but generally speaking, I enjoyed it because its pacing was decent. And it flowed for me reasonably well. It wasn't really scary. It was kind of scary, but, it was enjoyable. And War Z, I felt it was a good action-adventure film. I didn't think it was a good horror film. I mean, it kind of was scary a little bit in places, but it was an action-adventure film that I really enjoyed. And, and like another example, the Mummy Returns. I think it's the best of all the Mummy movies. I love that movie. I thought the first one was fun. It was enjoyable, but the second one was great. And I think I know why. The Mummy Returns for me kind of marked this point where movies started to draw influence from video games. Because if you look at how action adventure movies are starting to be played out, they kind of mimic a video game style. And it's like, the best way I can describe it is that these are movies that I could just visualize myself playing as a video game. And The Mummy Returns was the very first movie that I got that with. This is totally tangential, by the way, but this does kind of get to the point of, one of the problems with game reviews, and it's also one of the problems with movie reviews too, is that you do come up with a lot of subjectivity creep. I have a name for it, where you have this subjectivity creep in how a piece of media is evaluated. And that starts to overwhelm the blasted monitor. My light source right now is basically my monitor because it's totally dark in my room and I don't actually have a lamp in my room. Anyways, that's neither here nor there. You get this subjectivity creep into how media is evaluated, especially if there's a scoring system. The scoring system will be more subject to that subjectivity creep than anything else, I believe. And one of the problems I notice with myself is that when I'm evaluating and reviewing any sort of media, and I have a score to look at, I will actually start to bias develop a level of bias towards the material based on that score. I have noticed this in myself as I'm evaluating, as I'm reading a review. I will see the score, and if it's like a 6.5 and it describes a game that's like I would actually really enjoy, I will be hesitant. But if I see like a 9.5 and it's a game I would really enjoy, I'll be like, yeah! And, that kind of makes sense because, all things being equal, that sort of makes sense. But it's like, I don't feel like part of the problem is that I feel that my decision to purchase a game is being influenced by that score in a way that doesn't accurately represent how much I would actually enjoy the game. That's what I personally experience, and that's what I'm also concerned about that happens with other people. I think it does, but I don't know for sure. And then you run into these huge issues in that where you have bonuses and whatnot that are tied to these scores that the reviewers can then manipulate. And that's basically political. That's political scoring that really doesn't have anything to do with the game, but has everything to do with whether or not the reviewers feel generous to actually allow that game to get that bonus, assuming that there's a public knowledge on that bonus. And then, of course, you get issues where it's like, okay, well, if there's a bonus tied to that, well, let's spend a little bit of money that would come from that bonus into, convincing reviewers to give us good enough scores to make it work. So you would run into a lot of complications with that, and if it's just limited to the objective criteria, I mean, you're still not... If it's limited to objectively definable criteria, if the score is just based on things you can measure, like frame rate, cross-platform compatibility, the level of options you have in games. I'm sure there's others. These are just the ones coming up off the top of my head. But if you limit it to that, it's a lot easier to spot reviews that are biased either by the inclusion of subjective elements or by political maneuvering on the back end that we're not aware of. It becomes much easier to identify that. So I think that there might be an option there for including scores if it's based off of objective criteria that a bunch of people, basically everybody can agree, yeah, we can specifically measure these things and connect it to a score. In a way, it almost becomes formulaic, and the score still has meaning, but it doesn't actually become a part of the review. It doesn't become a part of the conversation about the game, which I think is exactly where it should be. So, anyways, coming up on 30 here, so that was just my thoughts regarding as sort of a feed-off of the conversation between Total Biscuit and Stephen Totilo. One other thing, I'm gonna link to a video that I really enjoyed. It's almost like a Gamergate encouragement video, for those of us who are starting to feel a little burnt out and a little bit down on it, and it felt really good to watch. I don't know how it comes across to people who are outside of Gamergate. It could be positive or negative depending on one's perspective. Excuse me, but yeah, I mean, if you support Gamergate, I recommend seeing the video, and I'll have a link in the description. Because it's something that feels really good to watch, and it serves as a really good reminder that, not only are we doing something that matters, but we're actually making a difference. Slowly and in small pieces, but you know, it puts things into a lot of perspective that honestly makes me feel really good about being a part of Gamergate. So, anyways, folks, until next time.